All right, everyone. Thank you for attending this webinar today, this afternoon. My name is Liam Cunningham, and I'm the volunteer coordinator with Layers of London. And this is our 8th, I think, maybe, session in our series of lockdown webinars. And today we're going to be hearing from Giles Darkes, who's the cartographer and works with the Historic Towns Trust, and was instrumental in creating the Medieval and Tudor maps of London that show the City of London and surrounding areas as they were hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So he'll tell us a bit about the process behind creating those. Just to explain a bit how it works, none of you can be seen or heard, so you'll communicate through the chat box if you have questions. But we'll have a Q&A session at the end. So if you want to save your questions until then, unless it's something urgent like the sound has gone out or anything like that, you can just put that in whenever, and I'll try sort that out. So I think, does that make sense? Did I cover everything, Giles?
Okay, right.
Over to you. I'll just make sure you can, I'll stop sharing and make sure that you can share. Okay.
Excellent.
All right.
Yep, good. Okay, well, hello everybody. Very pleased to be with you. My name is Giles Darkes, and I'm a cartographer and cartographic project manager. And one of the things that I do is I do a lot of work for the Historic Towns Trust. And the Historic Towns Trust is a charity which produces atlases and maps of historic British towns. And I would like to talk to you this afternoon about the whole process of making historical maps, obviously with special emphasis on the 2 maps that we contributed to the Layers of London project, the map of Tudor London, so London about 1520, and more recently the map of London at the high point in its medieval fortunes, so between 1270 and 1300. Now, you'll be pleased to know that you won't just have to look at my ugly mug for the next half an hour or so. The whole business of making maps is essentially one of producing a graphic, so clearly it makes sense to actually show you lots of graphics. And I hope that by showing you these graphics and explaining how we actually make maps, it gives you some idea into the whole method of production that we use. And I also want to have a look at some of the issues that arise with producing maps of the historic environment. One of the things that you will probably be aware of is that maps look definitive. And when something appears on a map, it has an authority. And it may not actually merit that authority. And so I want to have a look at the issues surrounding how you choose what to put on a map, and also some of the historical sources of information that we can use as cartographers. So what I want to do is to share with you PowerPoint presentation. Let's just get this up and running. All being well, it will work. Okay, so as I say, I'm Giles Darkes, the cartographic editor for the Historic Towns Trust. And the maps that you're probably familiar with, hopefully you're using them on the Layers of London project. There are 2 maps in particular. There's this map, it's the map of London in 1520. And the other one is going back earlier in time, London between about 1270 and 1300. Well, the origin of both of these maps actually is a publication which is called the British Historic Towns Atlas. It's been through varied fortunes, it has to be said, but one of the most important volumes it produced was the one that I'm showing you now, which is volume 3, which was produced, I think it was published in 1989, which shows the City of London from prehistoric times to about 1520. And as well as an introductory text and a gazetteer listing the sites of interest within it, it also had a series of maps, and one of the most important ones, this one, This is actually a joined together image showing maps which were actually originally spread across 4 atlas pages. But this was eventually produced as a separate publication. I'm going to zoom in a moment and show you some detail on it. But just to give you an idea of the geographical extent it shows, here you can hopefully make out the wall of the City of London going around the outside here. Here's the Tower of London, and over here we have St. Paul's Cathedral. And what we produced from that was this. The map I showed you a moment ago was the basis for producing this, but it's actually quite different in lots of ways. Although it was based on that map, you'll see that now we have a much wider geographical coverage. So we haven't just stopped at the city wall and slightly beyond it, but we've actually gone out into what were fields beyond the city wall at that time. And we've also gone southwards as well into Southwark. And you'll also see, if I just go back to the previous slide here, that we've also tried to match it to modern map coordinates, a process which is called Geo Rectification. I'll show you some examples of that later. So the idea is that this map will actually sit quite comfortably with modern maps of London. And that's one of the reasons why in the Layers of London project, you can switch between the map of modern London and this one, and obviously other maps as well. Well, if we zoom in a little bit, you can see the sort of level of detail that it contains. And although perhaps the style of mapping looks a bit old-fashioned now, just remember that this was produced using manual techniques. This is before digital cartography. And in fact, it actually is the result of an enormous amount of scholarship. So not only do we have the road network here, but we also have the positions of a large number of buildings actually shown on the map. Here you can see St. Paul's Cathedral in the top right, but you can also see the Blackfriars, the Dominican friary over to the left as well, and a host of other buildings. And this was actually compiled by firstly using a map of London straight after the Great Fire in 1666, produced by a cartographer called Leake. And his map was taken as the basis. He actually provided a lot of information in his survey about the width and size of pre-fire streets. That was used to reconstruct the road network. And then all sorts of historical and archaeological information was used to actually put on the position of these buildings. And it's really very hard to over-exaggerate how much work and how long it takes to produce a map like this. Well, the more up-to-date version, this is our version here, you'll now see is in full colour. This was the result of digitizing the map that you've just seen, actually converting it into, in this case, Adobe Illustrator file. But we took the opportunity to examine every single item on the map to see if it had been updated in the 30 years since the Atlas of London was first produced. There's been a lot of historical and archaeological research undertaken. And what you can see now is, for example, if you look at the Blackfriars, if I just go back to the previous version of it, sorry, I'm just going forward there rather than back. Let's just go back one. If you just compare the version of the Blackfriars there over on the left with the one on the right here, you can see it's actually really quite different. And this is the result of a lot of work undertaken by Dr. Nick Holder, who has become an expert on the medieval religious houses of London. Well, the other map that we used in terms of constructing our new maps was this one here, the map of the City of London circa 1270. And this is the map that actually appeared in the Atlas volume. And it's slightly ironic that the population of the City of London around 1270 was actually larger than it was around 1520. And yet the map looks a little bit more sparse. And the reason for that is that, of course, the further back in time you go, the less certain we can be of what was actually in a city. London has constantly regenerated itself, and so the chances of old items of interest, particularly buildings, remaining is actually really quite small, because cities that are prosperous rebuild themselves, and therefore they tend to obliterate traces of the past. Nonetheless, those traces are still there. They're revealed archaeologically, sometimes in chance finds in terms of documents, and also in the painstaking work of historians in reconstructing what was actually there at the time. If we zoom into that map, again, the same area here, you can see that what the 1989 Atlas did was to use in the background, in red in this case, or magenta, 1520 map for comparison, but to put on it in a limited range of colours the buildings that were there in 1270. What we did was, again, to take that initial map and to examine every single thing that was shown on there, and to put it on if appropriate, or to amend it if we thought we had better information. And by we, I have to say that it's not me. I'm not a historian, I'm a cartographer, but I was very fortunate to work with a team of historians led by Professors Caroline Barron and Vanessa Harding, who I think are actually joining us this afternoon. Very great scholars, but also very adept at finding the information that we need to put on the maps. And I'd like to show you an example of how those maps were originally produced, which is sort of fairly typical of the way that historical maps were produced, and indeed still are. This is a manual compilation showing the Charterhouse area of London, so just outside the city wall. Charterhouse, of course, is still there. And what you've got here on the right are the annotations and corrections and checking of Colonel Henry Johns, who was the cartographer, founder of a cartographic company, in fact, called Lovell Johns, which is still going. And you can see his notes here. And if we look in a little bit more detail, this is the sort of level of detail. He's made some notes here. It says Goose Lane by St Mary Le Bow is in the wrong place. And so that was later corrected. Well, the result is that we have been creating new maps, as I say, using Adobe Illustrator. And this is a screenshot to actually show you essentially what it looks like when I'm working on the maps. This is the screen that I see. And on the right over here, you can see a whole string of different layers. Illustrator is a great design program, but it's not specifically intended for cartography. But the reason that it lends itself very well to producing maps is that it is a graphics program that builds up graphics in layers. And maps are essentially built up in layers. And really there are four elements to almost every map. You have areas, so that's to say the large areas. In this case, you can see we've got an area of green here, polygons filled in green. You have lines, and here you can see the lines of the parish boundaries that have been superimposed. You have point features, a little bit difficult to show you a point feature at this scale, but point features are things like the conduit up here, which is a round circle filled with a colour. And then you have text. You have all four of those elements. And on the right here, you can see that I've actually got some of the text in different layers that I put on: text for street names, text for river names. And so using Illustrator, we can actually build up a map using layers. And this is the way that you achieve a final graphic that is clear and is suitable, in this case, for print, or indeed for showing in another medium, like on the layers of London. Well, this is the medieval map of London, and you will see that it's an image which shows the full extent of the map sheet, but it also shows that it has some of the other elements that you normally associate with a printed map, namely a title and also a legend as well. And you'll find that on the layers of London, that legend appears, but it's available separately. But any map that's worth salt should really be capable of being interpreted without reference to the legend. You should be able to get a pretty good idea of what a map is telling you without having to look and see what all those symbols mean. But here we have a selection from that legend, and you can see some of the colours that are being used. And if I compare that legend with a section of the map, in this case it's the area around the Guildhall, you can see what some of those colours actually mean. Here we've got the Guildhall as a civic building, but we've also got the many parish churches in this sort of pinky colour up here and down here, which both maps are dotted with. London had more than 100 parishes within its walls. So that's the legend. One of the great advantages of digital cartography, of course, is that you can add colour relatively easily, and colour is a really useful tool for the cartographer. Well, I thought that we have this thing called geo referencing, and what that means is taking buildings whose position you know that appear on your map and making sure that they appear in the same position essentially on a modern map. And here we've got the background map of the layers of London, and this is the section here around same sort of area I've just shown you. This was the Steelyard, so this is now Cannon Street railway station, Steelyard being the home of the German Hanseatic merchants in London. So if we now fade in the Tudor London map, hopefully you can see the two there at the same time. You can see that they don't quite coincide. Hopefully, if I just go back to that, there's the modern street pattern, and there's the Tudor street pattern. And it is inevitable there's going to be some discrepancy between the two. And so layers of London, what they have to do is to try and get the layers to coincide as well as possible by a process which is called rubber sheeting, taking those points whose position you know and tying them to the base map in the right place. And if I now fade it up to completely the full map, you can see what it looks like now. And of course, one of the great things about layers of London is that you can vary the transparency of every layer. Now, taking older maps, and this is a historical map, this is William Morgan's map of 1682, the problems of tying in these maps become greater. And here is Morgan's map of 1682, a truly useful map, a fantastic resource for historians of London. And there it is, actually half faded so that you can see what's going on in the background. And there is not a perfect coincidence between the two. And that is one of the disadvantages in using historical maps for information. But nonetheless, they are fantastically useful, and having this facility here to be able to overlay them and to look one to another is really useful. Well, the map of London between 1270 and 1300 also includes an inset map showing Westminster around 1290. And this again is a useful addition because although Westminster was a separate place, clearly it was very important. It was the religious centre as opposed to the commercial or royal centre, and separate to the City of London. So we also included that as well. And again, the information here was provided by a very good historian of Westminster, Tim Tatton-Brown. And so you have that as an additional layer to look at in Layers of London. Well, setting the scene, the Historic Towns Trust also produces other maps. It's not just maps of London, and we have a series of maps that we produce, and indeed atlases, that are based on digitizing large-scale ordnance survey maps from the 19th century, and then adding on top of that multi-period historical information. And it's quite a challenge to do. This is a wonderful ordnance survey map of York in 1850. If you do a search online, you can actually find this map. The whole of it is available free of charge online. But what we did was to take this map, and the process here is very typical of the way we'll go about it, and turn it into this. So digitizing, this is vector digitizing for those of you who are familiar with this. So this is not a dumb image. We can actually pick up all of those different buildings and other polygons on the map and fill them with colour. And what you can see is that we have a background map, which is that Ordnance Survey map, but we've enhanced it by showing medieval buildings and post-medieval. The medieval ones are those which are shown in the gold colour. The post-medieval buildings, for example, the buildings down here on the left, are those shown in a pink colour. And the dividing line between these two is 1540. So essentially the time of the Reformation. To use another example from York, here is the King's Manor. It's the building over on the right-hand side here, which is next to the site of the enormous St. Mary's Abbey, one of the largest monastic houses in the north of England. And this is how it's depicted on our maps. And you can see that these maps are good general purpose historical reference maps. They actually contain, again, a great deal of information. Different style of cartography, but the idea is the same, to convey the historic environment on top of a background map. And the other series that we produce are these. This is a historical map of Hull, and here in the background we actually have a facsimile Ordnance Survey map. So this is not digitized, this is simply a scan, which has been, the different map sheets have been joined together, but we've overlain on their historical information. The reason for doing this is twofold. Firstly, it is a cheaper process, in all honesty. Producing a fully vectorized map is very expensive. It's an expensive business. But the other reason, a very positive reason for doing it, is that in this case, the map of Hull in the background was from 1923, which is the time of the peak of Hull's industrial prowess, and also, critically, before the Second World War altered the townscape of Hull very, very drastically indeed. And just zooming in here, you can see the effect that we have here. I use different tints of colours so that you can see the background map through them. And the colours, of course, relate in this case to different forms of land use. Still got the gold colour here for St. Mary's Church for the medieval features. We still have a pink colour for post-medieval features. But I've distinguished, for example, in this case, religious buildings and also industrial buildings. Here we have a printing works, and over here we have warehouses, which are yet a different colour. This map has proved very successful. It was produced because Hull was UK City of Culture in 2017. It was actually launched exactly 3 years ago this week, and it's been an amazingly good seller. There's a lot of interest in Hull's history. Well, I want to move now on to that issue that I mentioned at the beginning by way of conclusion, which is just looking at some of the issues that you're always faced with when you're producing historical maps. As I said before, maps tend to become definitive, and once you put something on a map, a line or an area, it looks very believable. And the map reader has no way of knowing the authority behind that map, whether what is being shown is reasonable or not. Now here we have a map of York. This is from the Historic Towns Atlas of York, and the atlases contain a series of maps which show the towns phases in their development. And this is the Anglian phase of York, so between the Roman and the high medieval period, when actually very little is known about York. And what we've tried to do is to indicate with two different shades of colour how certain we are about the areas of settlement. And to explain them, this is what the legend shows, and it's a phrase. It says area of possible Anglian settlement or activity, and secondly, area of sporadic Anglian settlement or activity. So we're sort of hedging our bets, but quite deliberately, because it's incumbent on the cartographer not to deceive the map reader if possible. So actually putting on phrases like this and choosing an appropriate wording is really quite important. We can also use words. Quite clearly in this case, on the top left here, we've got extract from the medieval map of London, Walbrook possibly culverted. We don't know, it may have been there. Bottom right, this is from a map I'm working on at the moment of Coventry. Castle chapel, so we have a symbol which indicates we don't really know its exact form. Putting a question mark after the label also gives you that sense of doubt as well. And we can use different forms of symbology. Again, this is from the map of Coventry. Two different forms of lost medieval building here. Priory Gatehouse, we pretty much know was there, but we don't know whether the Priory slaughterhouse was actually in that position, and we certainly don't know what its form was. So hopefully these symbols will lend the map reader some sort of idea about how certain or uncertain we are. Now, it's also worth pointing out as well that putting anything on a map, particularly a historical map, is the result of an editorial decision. And contributors and editors don't always agree. And I want to show you here an example. This is from that map of York that I showed you earlier. This is, you can just see off to the right, St. Mary's Abbey, but we know that somewhere around here was the almonry. And these are three different phases in the development of this map. The contributor thought, the main contributor to this part of this period of the atlas, thought that the almonry was there. The editor remained totally unconvinced, and eventually it appeared there, but you can see now that we actually have the almonry garth here. So I'll just go back to the previous slide. That's where the contributor thought it was. That's where the editor finally actually accepted it was going to be. And so everything that appears on the map is the result of selection and editorial decisions. They don't appear there by chance. And just here, here's the Priory and Hospital of St. Mary, Bethlehem on the map of London in 1270. We know that the precinct of it and its area, its curtilage, looked approximately like that. We don't know its exact limits. Should we put it on or should we leave it off? At the end of the day, it is better and more useful to the map reader to put on to the map something which you're uncertain of and indicate that uncertainty. And it then stimulates debate and discussion, and hopefully it actually resolves issues later. If somebody comes along and says the Priory grounds didn't extend there, I've got evidence for this or for that, then of course, now that this map is digital, we can actually update it and we can amend it for subsequent editions. Well, just to finish off, I want to have a look at using historical maps as sources. And this I mentioned before, John Leake, who provided the map which formed the basis of the London map. But this is actually Wenceslaus Holler's depiction of London just after the Great Fire. It's a fantastically useful map. How reliable are historical maps? We're always seduced by their rather nice look, their works of art. There's something sort of dependable about them. How reliable are they? Well, I just want to show you an example. Cartographers are more reliable than others. Here we have three extracts from maps of Oxford. The one on the left over here is from a map produced in 1578 by Ralph Agas. The one in the middle was produced by David Logan in 1688. And on the right, we have here Ordnance Survey of 1876, and it is deliberately upside down because these two maps on the left are also upside down. But just look at the wall over here. It is arrowed. This V shape in the boundary of the Whitefriars here, the medieval monastery, is very distinctive. And you can actually see that same V shape on David Logan's map here. Was it real or was it made up? Well, looking at the Ordnance Survey map of 1876, here is exactly that same V shape here. And it is a real V shape. It actually exists and was, in fact, the wall of part of Beaumont Palace. And if you go to Oxford, it's now a rather undistinguished store for rubbish bins, I'm afraid, behind a Chinese restaurant. But it is still there. This is a medieval palace boundary wall. And so we can use corroborating evidence to assess that, in this case, the early cartographers actually got it right. And so you can, to some degree, trust them. It very much varies from one cartographer to another. And just by way of a word of warning, don't be seduced by good looks. Here we have an extract from a survey by a very well-known surveyor, John Roke, surveyed in 1753 from his survey Berkshire. And you can see lots of fields. To concentrate on a particular area here, bounded by 3 roads. And a reasonable interpretation of this would be that the field pattern around that area looked like that. But when you then compare that with the Ordnance Survey drawing of 1809, you can see in fact that John Roke's fields, although they look very plausible, actually did not bear much resemblance to the reality. So you do need to treat them with caution. And I want to finish with a sequence which I hope will amuse you quite a lot. Mistakes on maps are often perpetuated, and it's very easy to fall into that trap yourself as a cartographer. And I want to show you a sequence of maps that just illustrate this. Here we have a map, a very well-known map of Wiltshire by really the greatest Elizabethan cartographer, Christopher Saxton, in 1579. And we're going to concentrate on the area down here, that is Salisbury, the town of Salisbury there. And this is how he depicted that area. And I want you to notice, I've arrowed it here, a village which doesn't have a name on it. Underneath it is South Berkham, but that is a separate village south of the river shown there. That village itself doesn't actually have a name. Well, cartographers historically, and of course still, always copy one another, including, unfortunately, the mistakes. And 30 years after this map was produced, the greatest cartographer of the Jacobean era, John Speed, produced his own map of Wiltshire. Very fine work it is too, but he used Christopher Saxton's map as not only an inspiration, but as an outright source for his own maps. And in particular, he noticed that that village had no name on the map. And so, being an educated sort of chap, he wrote a note to himself in Latin, quaere, meaning check or find out. And unfortunately, his engraver actually thought that this was the name of the village and put it onto the map. And there you have the village of Quaere, which is not its right name. So that was John Speed in 1610, and you will then find that for the next 150 years, the village of Quaere appears on a series of maps. There's Blau, there's Morden's map of 1695. Here we have Richard Bloom's map of 1716, and Herman Moll's 1742. And it wasn't, in fact, until 1760, so exactly 150 years after Speed's map, that the right name was assigned to that village, the village of North Berkham. So there's a salutary lesson to you about not always trusting maps if you're going to copy them. You do have to check your own information. Well, just to bring us back to where we started, here's the map of Tudor London. It's a great resource. I hope that you find it interesting to see. Remember when you're looking at it that the map was compiled at a scale of 1 to 2,500. So if you zoom in expecting to see more detail, you're not going to see it there. It's generalized to that scale 1 to 2,500, which it was designed for print purposes. Layers of London has been absolutely fantastic. It's a really good outlet. If you're interested to actually see a print version of this as well, then you might like to know that both the Tudor London map and medieval London maps are available as printed sheets, quite large printed sheets. These are the two maps that are available, as they say, from all good bookshops, and with any luck from bad ones as well. And at a mere £9.99, the advantage of getting it is that, or getting them, is that on the back you have a complete listing of all the streets and all the buildings that appear with their grid references. You've also got lots of supplementary information where you have essays about London and its history, and also topic boxes as well, for example, about the vineyards that could be found in medieval London. We have to finally just thank, well, Layers of London helped to sponsor the map of medieval London, as did the Aurelius Charitable Trust. And these are the people who helped principally contribute to the medieval map and also to the Tudor London map as well. And if you're interested in more information, if you want to look at those, the original maps of London that we based our digitizing on, then that is the web address. You can find those maps, you can download them for free, you can examine them. Just bear in mind, as I say, that the maps that are now on Layers of London are much more up to date in terms of the information available. But nonetheless, you can have a look at the older maps and also read the text that goes with them and understand the genesis and the development of those maps as well. Okay, well, I hope that's given you a bit of an insight into what we do, how we go about creating historical maps. And so I think it's back to Liam now. If any of you have any questions, then I'm more than happy to try and field them.
Yeah, thanks very much, Giles. That was really interesting and great to learn about the process behind making these maps and also the challenges, I suppose, and also those amusing stories like the Priory village. It's a shame they didn't adopt the name.
It is, isn't it? Yeah.
So yeah, any questions, feel free to type them in the chat and I can read them out. I was just wondering, Giles, have you always worked in historic maps or did you start to specialize in this?
No, I haven't always worked in historical maps. That's really, although I have been working in them for quite a long time, my general sort of interest is in thematic maps. Maps broadly come into two very broad categories: topographic maps, which are general purpose reference maps, and then thematic maps, where some specific theme, whether it's history or statistics or anything like that, are shown against a background map. And thematic mapping has always been my particular interest. But I very much enjoy working with historical subjects, and it's always interesting. It's always a challenge. There's an element of detective work in it. I think lots of historians actually like detective stories and detective work, and certainly compiling a map, there's very much that element in it, and that I find really interesting.
We have a question through from Helen, who says, many thanks for this. How does the Tudor map of London compare to the University of Victoria's map of early modern London? Similarities or differences of approach?
I have to say, I don't honestly know offhand. You've completely caught me out there. I'm sorry, I can't answer that without making it up. Sorry.
That's all right. We have a question from Chris. Thank you so much for this fascinating walkthrough of your Adobe Illustrator artwork. Do you use a process of geo-referencing, geo-correction beforehand? And if so, could you briefly walk us through the process / software tools you use?
Yes, the geo-referencing is done on the base maps that you then digitize. And these are normally done using ArcGIS, which has appropriate tools to actually do this. Essentially, what you're doing is you're taking a scan of, take for example, an Ordnance Survey map sheet, and you are taking firstly the four corners of it and moving those to where they should be, put that in inverted commas, but where they are on a modern map. But you're then also looking for specific features on that map, for example, the corner of a church or some other building that is on both the historic map and also on the modern map. And you're tying the two in together. It's a process which is called rubber sheeting. And you're basically rubber sheeting, with the rubber sheeting, you're stretching it differentially across the map. And the more points of reference that you can have, the more points in common between the historic map and the modern map, then the better is going to be the fit. And that process is undertaken before you actually digitize it. You can, to some extent, do it afterwards, but it is easier to do it beforehand.
And a question from Nikki. Thank you very much. That was super interesting. I create historic character maps, and my question is, how do you choose what to put in without making it overcrowded?
Right, well, that's it. That is a very good question, actually. When you're producing any map, you have to produce a map that is readable. Now, that sounds like a very obvious statement, but all of you will have seen maps where, frankly, there's so much information on it, or it's so poorly presented, that you really can't see the wood for the trees. And so one of the jobs you have to do as a cartographer is to work out how best to symbolize everything you want to put on the map. And you also, essentially, compiling a map is often a question of not deciding what to put on it, but what to leave out. And if you put too much information on it, whether it's background information or thematic information, then you're in danger of overloading the map. And so you're constantly having to review and to work out whether you've got too much information in a particular place. And you want some, obviously, consistency across the map, but that's the cartographer's job. And with many thematic maps, you also have to bear in mind that you may want some features deliberately to look more important than others, but many other features should all look about the same in terms of their level of importance. So, for example, if you're looking, say, at a land use map, I appreciate it's not a historical map, but a land use map, there's nothing really more important about any one type of land use, whether it's growing arable crops or pasture, than the other. And so you have to choose colors which are of similar weight so that the map reader, when they look at the map, has the impression that everything is of equal importance. There's often an element of suck it and see in this. You have to experiment. With both the medieval and the Tudor London maps, one of the problems we had was that you can see there are large areas outside the city which were essentially agricultural. They were pasture or fields. And it's a large area graphically on the map. And so actually choosing a color that wasn't too dominant was really difficult. And in fact, the color that you've got there, although it looks hopefully to you like a green, isn't actually a green, it's actually a form of gray, but it gives the impression of being green, and hopefully it's not too dominant. But that was the result of quite a lot of experimentation.
Okay, it looks very green to me, I thought. Jerome asks, do you have a preferred historical cartographer?
Gosh, no, that is difficult, actually. I think of all cartographers, one of the ones that I admire most was a cartographer called Bradford Washburn, who's American, who died a few years ago, but he produced a very well-known map of Mount Everest, which is a superb piece of cartography. It is a truly great piece of art. And I was very fortunate about 18 months ago to meet up with someone who had actually lived opposite to Bradford Washburn in Boston, Massachusetts, and knew him very well. And he gave me actually a signed book by Bradford Washburn, which I'm very, very proud to have. But in terms of historical cartographers, I don't have a favourite. They all have their interest. I tend to like the map that I'm looking at the time.
Mm-hmm.
So I see, sorry to interrupt you, Liam, I see that Vanessa Harding has just replied about the University of Victoria. I don't know if you want to read out her response.
Oh, yeah. The question about how does this map differ from University of Victoria's map of early London, modern London? Vanessa Harding says, it differs in that ours starts with a modern map and works back, adding historical detail, and theirs uses a historic map, the woodcut or Agas map of circa 1570, and seeks to make it more cartographically accurate.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Vanessa. That's a useful explanation.
So we just have a few other questions. There's been a good few. Jeanette asks, I am interested in an 18th century map of the Foundling Hospital, which has a garden behind the building. I understand that often maps were more accurate if people had access to the area and it was a place you could visit. I wonder if that would suggest the garden layout could be reasonably accurate, even if we need to be cautious about that statement.
Again, it is hard to give a definitive answer to that. In the 18th century, map making was dominated by surveyors, who were, that we would now call them cartographers, but what they did was to combine ground surveying with producing maps. And they very often worked for patrons who had a specific request to produce a map. Sometimes they work speculatively, but usually it's working for a patron. It sounds to me as if the map you're describing was produced for a particular patron. If they had access to the buildings and to the garden, then there's a reasonable chance that what is being shown there may well have actually been there. It would be interesting to compare it with an early Ordnance Survey map, for example, one of the mid-19th century very large-scale maps of London, and just where they did actually depict the layout of gardens, of public gardens, to a considerable level of detail, and just to see whether it actually looks plausible by comparing the two maps. It's quite possible that what is shown on the 18th century map was actually there.
John asks, what towns and cities are the Historic Towns Trust looking at publishing on in the future?
Right, that's a good question. I'm glad you've asked that. So in terms of maps, at the moment I'm working on historical maps of Coventry. I mentioned it in the presentation. Next year, Coventry is UK City of Culture, and by the end of this year, we will have had a historical map of Coventry produced. I'm also working on Canterbury as well, and again, that map is very well advanced. We're working on a map of Bristol around 1480, which again should be out at the end of this year. And in terms of atlases, it's very likely that the Canterbury map will lead on to an atlas. And we're also finalising an atlas of Oxford, which will be out at the end of this year. That is a major undertaking. Producing a historic towns atlas is a great deal of work. You might be interested to know actually that producing the Tudor London map actually took me, just me alone, about 500 hours work. That's a lot of work, and that doesn't include all the input from the historians as well. So it's a great deal of work to produce these. It's impossible to exaggerate how long it takes, but it is interesting work.
Okay, I think I'll just do maybe one or two more questions. Peter has a long question. We'll see how we do. Are there ways that those interested in creating historical vectorized maps, perhaps on a relatively modest scale, i.e. me, an early career researcher on a temporary contract, could A, get access for a limited time to expensive proprietary software, Adobe Illustrator, ArcGIS, B, attend groups or workshops that could offer skills and training support for map development? I have attended the Lancaster HGIS summer school previously, but I am now looking for other informal continuing support, and I don't have a large budget.
Okay, that's a very good question. Right, in terms of the software, Illustrator is part of the Adobe Creative Cloud, and the only way that you can get that now is by the up-to-date versions is by subscribing to it. You can no longer buy the software outright, and to buy the full package costs about £50 a month, so it's not cheap. However, you can actually acquire and own forever older versions which certainly have all the functionality that you would need for much less money. ArcGIS is very expensive. It's designed as software for not really for individuals, but for companies to use. I think that would be fair to say. And so you're talking many thousands of pounds. However, there are other GIS programs which are available, some of them free. There are quite a lot out there which don't cost you anything. The thing is that you have to learn how to use them, and that takes quite a long time. In terms of training, then I suggest that you contact the British Cartographic Society, and their website is quite easy to remember. It's www.cartography.org, and they provide occasional training for people who are interested in, certainly in the basics of map production. And sorry, this is a plug for my own book, but I did produce a book, in fact, in conjunction with the British Cartographic Society called Cartography, an Introduction, which really is aimed at the complete beginner, and I hope it would give you some of the basics about map design and map production in there. So that's, I think, £10. Sorry about the plug, but I think it may be appropriate on this case.
Just one last question. Might not know the answer to this, but how well do modern writers, I'm thinking of Hilary Mantel as an example, do with fictional treatments that require a knowledge of London geography?
Very interesting question. Interestingly enough, I found that I've been contacted by people who are interested in historical fiction, who find our maps of medieval and Tudor London really useful. And you will find actually that a good historical writer of fiction worth their salt will actually do some research into the topographic layout of the city that they're writing about. Partly because they know that there'll be people there who say, well, you can't turn left and arrive at such and such a point. So they do take it into account. Hilary Mantel, I don't know specifically, but I certainly, as I say, have been contacted by other people who say, we find these maps really useful for historical fiction. So it's an outlet that we didn't actually anticipate, a very welcome one. In the same way that people who are interested in Shakespeare, for example, find the map of London in 1520 really useful.
Mm-hmm. Great, well, thanks very much, Giles. We've had a lot of comments in the chat saying thank you very much. Sarah Kirkley from the Irish Historical Towns Atlas Project says a lot of similar issues arise for them. So great presentation.
Thank you very much. Probably Sarah. If that's Sarah Gearty, then hello, Sarah. Great to hear from you.
Yeah, and just lots of thank yous. So, and thank you from us at Layers of London too. Great that you took the time out to do this.
Not at all. Thanks very much, Liam. I hope you enjoy the maps anyway, and continue to look at Layers of London.
Great, thank you. And thank you to everyone who attended as well. We'll be having more webinars over the next few weeks and maybe months. So make sure to keep an eye out on our mailing list and our social media for the latest news on all that. So I hope everyone has a very nice afternoon, and thank you for coming, and thank you again, Giles.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye-bye.